Just a sec.
Many thanks, Jonathan. So, welcome to the second of our webinars on community-led approaches to retrofit. If you've only just joined, it would be great if you could introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know your name, your organizational affiliation. And if this is the second or first time you've come along to one of these webinars, just as a quick bit of management, if you have a question, if you could pop it in the chat, that would be great. We will have question and answer sessions to answer those, but it is useful to have a view of the question in the chat. And we're going to do a quick poll to start off with, just so that we can judge where participants are at, I guess, on their journey and their organization's journey or engaging in retrofit.
Shall I launch it now?
Good, that'd be great.
Hopefully people can see it. You should be able to see it and vote. You can vote for more than one thing, so you don't have to say you're just one thing or another, because I know some people do a little bit of this and that. So, okay, a few more people. About half people have done it. I'll give you a few more minutes. Well, seconds maybe. Right, anyone else? Oh, that's practically everyone now, I think. Yeah. Okay.
Right.
I will end the poll and share the results. So you should be able to see those.
Yes, we've got a range of experience here, which is great. We've got just under half people not yet considering engaging in retrofit or not yet got started on that journey. But interesting, we've got 5 people here who already provide some retrofit advice and 4 who already do some retrofit advice for fuel poor. So please do use that knowledge you may well have different experiences to us. So please do use the chat and the question and answers to bring us the benefit of your experience. So I'll go on to, next slide. Come on, there we go. So this is one of 4 webinars. The very first was really about focused on the able to pay sector. And I'm going to hand over to Jonathan to give us a little recap.
Yeah, last week, the session is available for those that want to see it. But yeah, we focused on the able to pay. We looked at the opportunity working with innovators and early adopters to support the development of retrofit, looking at different types of personas and different people who are there that we could work with. We looked at kind of the business opportunity, focusing on like the design element of retrofit as a particular area that's not really well developed or provided for, and focusing on that fabric first approach. We looked at how we might help people, what the kind of needs were from householder clients, people overwhelmed by complexity and able to make decisions. And we looked at the services that we might be able to offer to meet those kind of needs around general advice to a more complete retrofit design service. And then we looked at a few case studies, some of these one-stop shops or one-stop shop ideas of like areas where people can go to, and the role that community energy could play in providing that one-stop shop or other services on the way to that.
So that the recording of that session was available to people who attended, though we can make it available to anyone who didn't attend last week and would like the full narrative. So if you could, I mean, I guess just pop it in the chat. Let us know via the chat. Is that a good idea? If you'd like us to send you the recording from last week. So first off, we haven't actually introduced myself. My name is Giovanna Speciale. I'm one of the founders and CEO of South East London Community Energy. Jonathan, could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Jonathan Atkinson. I'm a co-founder at Carbon Co-op, work mostly project manager and development, and my focus is on a lot of retrofit stuff. I'm now director and business director at People Powered Retrofit.
Nadia.
Hi everyone. Sorry my video is not working at the minute, but I am the project manager at South East London Community Energy, and I mainly focus on our Able to Pay retrofit project.
So today's webinar is focused on retrofit for fuel poor, but we're also going to be covering landlords and social housing. It's based on our experience as organisations, which is not comprehensive, but we would like to share what we've learned on our journey. We're going to go over a typology of the different types of funding for fuel poor, retrofit for fuel poor households. We're going to look at the supply chain. We're going to look at what I mean by a lead generator role, which is something that we at CLC have explored extensively. We're going to look at how else you can get involved in programs, funded programs for retrofit amongst the fuel poor sector. So looking at a role of assessor or retrofit coordinator. We're going to talk about landlords as a specific sector and also social housing. So just to kick off, really important to understand if you are going to engage in the sector for fuel poor, where the funding comes from. And we're going to look specifically at some main sources of funding listed on the slides. So let's talk about ECO and EcoFlex. ECO stands for the Energy Company's Obligation. It's been in existence for 15 years. Yeah, a considerable amount of time. The current iteration and is called Eco 3. So we're just about to go in a transition period that goes into Eco 4. Each iteration has different rules about who is eligible, but particularly what measures can be done, what measures can be funded and by how much, and what combination of measures, and what is required of the retrofit contractor. Since Eco 2 transition, which is about 2017, the funding has been really focused on fuel poor households. And under Eco 4, the iteration that's about to start, there are 3 different ways in which somebody can qualify for funding. Either they are in receipt of means tested benefits, so they qualify under central government criteria, or you can qualify via criteria that have been set by your local authority. This is known as LA Flex. Or, and this is a new thing, or perhaps a reintroduced thing, you can qualify for ECO under criteria that are defined by your energy supplier. And what we have found, so my organisation engages in this extensively in order to get funding out to fuel poor households for retrofit measures. What we have found is that there are 2 ways in which this can work. Either the community energy group goes out and through their energy advice finds people who are eligible for this and works with a contractor to get the funding, to get the money spent. Or alternatively, the contractors go out there, they use big data to identify properties that are potentially in need of measures that can be funded via ECO, and they go and do door knocking. This could all change under Eco 4 because suppliers are able to deliver the measures as well. So I imagine what we'll get is plenty of suppliers engaging with their own customers to meet their ECO obligation. One thing I should make clear is that ECO is a carbon obligation. It's a carbon reduction obligation, not a fuel poverty obligation. So the amount of funding that you get for any particular measure is aligned with how much it reduces carbon emissions rather than how much it necessarily helps or what the needs of the client are. It's a very useful source of funding, but I should make clear that in my experience, there is always a problem with ECO. In that generally, for a lot of the measures, such as external wall insulation, it's not 100% funding. So certainly if you've got a terraced house and you want to get some external wall insulation on there, that's the measure that's most needed. It won't cover 100% of the cost. It's certainly not something that takes a client-centered approach. It's really a carbon-centered approach. So what tends to happen is that for a lot of houses, it won't cover the whole cost of the measure. So what's required is a customer contribution. And what you get is you get a slight mismatch. So if you see this little Venn diagram, generally what you're looking for, the people that can get funding through ECO are a very small percentage of those who are eligible for it or in need of it, because they also, so you have to be poor enough, low income enough to be able to qualify for it, but also high income enough to be able to add in a bit of funding of your own if you're a client. So there's always a little bit of a rub in our experience with ECO, or this very small amount of people who are both low income enough and high income enough to be able to qualify. So the second source of funding for Fuel Poor is Green Home Grant Local Area Delivery Scheme. We're currently on the third iteration of it. I'm also going to talk about HUG, so that's the Home Upgrade Grant. Both of these are funded by BAYS. Eligibility for them is generally about having low income. So the criteria differ slightly from scheme to scheme, but generally it's below 30,000, an income of below 30,000 or £20,000 after housing costs, and having an EPC of D or below. But for HUG, the difference is that it is specifically for off-gas properties. There is a very confusing nomenclature associated with this, that we are currently in the third iteration of this funding. And the third iteration is known as sustainable warmth. So what you get is you get various bodies able to deliver this. In London, it's confusing. You've got the hub, the Southeast Energy Hub, able to deliver this. You've also got the GLA able to deliver this, and in some cases, the local authority. So what we've got is a ridiculous situation of competing for clients. If you want to know what's happening in your local area, who's delivering what, I've given a little link there. Are there any questions I should be answering? Those of you who've got an eye on the chat. Jonathan,
no,
Nadia.
You're good. There's a bit of discussion about the link from last week. That's all at the moment. Right. Okay. Great. All right. Just do let me know if you need me to stop, because this kind of stuff gets ridiculous. So, go on. Next slide. The other source of funding, and this really does depend on your area, is regional or local government initiatives. If you do a little internet search, you will see there's a host of government initiatives, or local bodies decide to spend a little bit of their funding on supporting fuel poor households. In London, it's known as Warm Homes. And what they've done is the delivery of that is the main managing agent for that source of funding is the same as the delivery agent for LAD3 or sustainable warmth, which means that it can act as top-up funding for what other schemes are able to provide. I'm not sure to what extent that happens in other areas. So this is a very, very crude diagram of the way these things are delivered. Generally, a management agent is appointed. That is often, as I'll go over in a minute, a very big organization that has a network, is associated with a network of contractors. All of this is delivered using PAS 2030 or PAS 2035 processes
That is a process that is very much defined by a body called Trustmark to ensure that what you get is good quality, that you get that to the greatest extent possible. The management agent takes a whole house approach, considers the house in its entirety, and delivers that which is best able to reduce costs and carbon. So below the management agent, what you get is a bunch of organizations that deliver. It's possible in many cases the management agent delivers the whole thing, but what's required is a team of people doing what's called retrofit assessment, going out and collecting data about each household. You also need a retrofit coordination, so somebody who's taking that information and deciding what measures need to be delivered. Oops, sorry, how do I go back? And you might also have an agency that is responsible for marketing and comms, getting the message out there so that people apply for it. And below that, you have a network of trust-marked contractors who deliver the work. The way that CELSI, my organisation, has engaged in this is that we've acted on several occasions as what we call the lead generator. One of the things you may not understand is that actually it's very difficult to find people who want these measures, are prepared to accept the disruption that retrofit entails, who understand. Finding people who will willingly go for this is actually much more difficult than you would expect. That there is a real resistance to undertaking retrofit. So, well, my organisation has always engaged in this as a lead generator. I'm going to talk about that role in ways big boys. So I've given some examples of people who I know are delivering this. There are many others. As I said, the contractors must be trust-marked, which is a little bit of a barrier for the smaller contractors. And often, and this is a possible role for community energy, that the bigger agencies who do energy advice are sometimes contracted to take a role, take the marketing communication role, and potentially this is a role that community energy groups could take on. I know that Acton Energy are delivering, have a chunk of funding to deliver across to do the marketing and comms associated with the schemes in the Midlands. So let's talk about that lead generator. As I said, there are multiple barriers to retrofit for fuel poor. Often the people who are most in need of it are the people who are least likely to put their hand up for it. This may be because they have there are attitudinal barriers. I can't tell you how many pensioners we've come across who said, look, I'm fine. I don't want to think of myself as vulnerable. Therefore, I do not want this funding. I mean, I know that sounds crazy, but multiple people I've come across have said, look, this isn't for me. I'm fine putting a jumper on with my house that is heated by a coal fire and has no insulation. I'm fine. I've been fine for years. Many of the barriers are attitudinal, but also they can be associated with language learning difficulties, with being generally too preoccupied with having a chaotic lifestyle and not being able to take that sort of broader approach. Actually, you've got day-to-day struggles, and really you can't look beyond them. So the role that my organisation has played is really about enabling those most vulnerable to access this funding. And the way we do that is we combine it with our fuel poverty advice, so we get funding in to do energy advice for people. We build that relationship of trust, and then it's a lot easier once we've got that relationship of trust. It's a lot easier to pose the question about, well, look, what's going to help you long term is improving the thermal efficiency of your home. That's the thing that's going to get your bills down long term. It's a lot easier to broach that conversation if you've already got that relationship of trust. So what we do is we do what I call community outreach. We as part of our fuel poverty service as well. We go out, we deliver workshops, go along to stalls, go community events, and generally work to engage those people who are most at risk. We will assess the eligibility, but also the feasibility of measures. So part of the lead generation role is about understanding what this particular source of funding can deliver and making sure the people who you're liaising with have the kind of household that can benefit from this. Generally, there is a business model, there's a social business model for this. It can generate a fee for any clients that complete. In the current system that we're working in LAD 2, it's £100. And really it is about enabling those people who are most vulnerable to access this funding. So we've participated in various schemes. Some of the schemes we've just sent the information about clients who would like to participate in the scheme off to a management agent, and they've taken it from there. In other schemes, we've had a more substantial role in support and handholding that client. And I can tell you, look, being able to handhold a client through this process increases uptake by about 50%. It doesn't generally work as a standalone business model. If actually all you're doing, if you're not doing the fuel poverty work, and if you're just relying on £100 per client, it generally doesn't work as a standalone business model, but it does work well as a supplement to fuel poverty alleviation work. So any questions? There was a hand up, wasn't there? Did someone have their hand up? Two participants have a raised hand.
We've got a couple of questions through the Q&A. Does £100 really cover your costs, particularly the costs of working with clients who don't go through to completion?
No, on its own, no. But generally what we're doing is we're using that £100 to do the hand-holding. So it's if you're doing fuel poverty alleviation work, so if you're getting in funding to be doing energy advice, what the £100 covers is to be able to spend some time enabling the client to apply for the funding, and then to call them at 3 or 4 times along the journey, just to reassure them. The £100 does cover that.
Yeah, we've got Denidra and Nick as well, who've had their hands up. I'll allow you to talk one at a time, and then Nick, Denidra's put her hand down. I'll allow Nick to talk. So there you go.
Hi.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, interesting model in terms of you mentioned about the resistance. I'm just talking from the northeast, so from experience here is this where I kind of have seen the resistance is from, if you like, the lead generator and the contractor not wanting to do the work. So it's very much about picking the lower hanging fruit, and those who are most in need are being excluded. So it really does press the argument for community energy groups that are working on a social enterprise, and I'm going to use that very loosely. Yeah, just being a kick doesn't make you a social enterprise. So yes, it'd be interesting to see how that, because it is the argument. I just think it's what are the motivations. Community energy groups have got a different motivation to private sector in terms of contractors and lead generators. And it's something I think local authorities and combined authorities and hubs really do need to kind of take a view on.
Great, thanks, Nick.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. And I have had multiple dialogues to convince people who manage these schemes of the benefit of being involved. So what a management agent generally wants to do is to deliver to the people who are easiest to deliver to. So typically, they are the people who are least in need. They may be parents who own their own property, where one parent is working, so temporarily they have a low income and temporarily can qualify. Quite often they're the most digitally included, and actually it's in the interest of the management agent and the contractors just to deliver to the low hanging fruit. those people who will respond to every email and respond to every letter and consistently answer the phone. And understand that, yes, there's a need for some disruption, and not demand that the contractors take off their shoes at the door or for, you know, or stop for prayer times or whatever, you know. I think it's up to community energy groups to keep on to convince the management agents and the local authorities that there is real benefit to community energy groups being involved and supporting those vulnerable clients through the process. And, you know, the argument is very much, we will make those vulnerable people low-hanging fruit. And we will do that by making sure that we handhold them through the process. And so one of the key things to do if you're generating a lead is when the client gets an offer, generally in these schemes, after a retrofit coordinator has been involved, they get an offer of a set of measures, is to go and explain the measures to the client. So there'll quite a lot of them be sat there going, oh, I expected windows. Actually, what I expected the retrofit assessor to say is that I needed windows, but hang on, you're telling me walls, is to explain the retrofit logic of that. And really, it massively increases uptake amongst the most vulnerable. So I'm going to talk through another thing that South East London Community Energy has done quite extensively. And I'm going to go, I'm going to go back to talking about ECO, the energy company's obligation. And I'm going to specifically talk about ECO LA, the local authority EcoFlex. So what happens in EcoFlex is the local authority, or in the case of London, the whole of London, defines a set of criteria that makes the client eligible for ECO. And in London, what they've tried to do is really take on board the cost of housing, the cost of living element that, you know, really affects us Londoners. What happens in most local authorities or most areas is the local authority defines what's called a statement of intent. They define the criteria codified in a statement of intent, and contractors will apply to the local authority for what's called a declaration. And in some cases, they will pay the local authority for a declaration. What happened in South London is that our local authorities couldn't be bothered with that. They really, really couldn't be bothered with all these contractors approaching them. So they asked us to be a middleman. What we do is we assess whether a client is eligible and whether the contractor has faithfully collected information relating to the client. So we have we've set up a system whereby contractors submit us information about clients. We assess whether they're eligible. We verify that they're eligible by calling the client, and then we request a statement of intent, a declaration from the local authority, and that attracts a fee of about £60. And actually, so it means, what it means is that it really enables the eco-funded work to come to South East London. They've got a very, very simple system, relatively low-cost system for collecting the data. The local authorities, their need is met because actually what they want to do is demonstrate to BEIS that what we've got is a very good system for ensuring that clients are in fact eligible. And you know, it's not a huge amount of money, but it really helps with subsidizing our fuel poverty work. There's always, when your fuel poverty work is mainly grant supported, there are always periods in between grants that you really need to cover. That's what our EcoFlex money covers. It generated about 10 grand last year. And so it's a really nice little social business model. Oops, I'm struggling to go on to the next slide. So I'm going to go back to talking about LAD schemes now. As I said, one of the ways every management agent who's delivering one of these schemes, LAD, HUG, what they need to do is collect some information from the householder. So in this latest version of LAD 2, my organisation has played the role of a retrofit assessor. To play the role of a retrofit assessor, you need to have staff who are DEAs, domestic energy assessors and RAs, retrofit assessors, and have a whole bunch of CPD qualifications like asbestos awareness. It means that we generate the lead, then one of our guys, ideally the same person who's done the fuel poverty advice for the client, goes out and does the assessment. And it just means that the client has to liaise with one body with whom they have trust. So it enables us to handhold the client a little bit further along the journey. It tracks a fee, which helps us employ our staff in between grants. So, you know, this has worked quite well with our LAD too. Another role that you could potentially play as a, sorry?
There was just a question on previous, which is the LA Flex income was around, is it correct that it was around £10,000 for you last year based on around £60 per client?
Yes.
Yeah, brilliant. Cool. Just clarifying that.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, and perhaps one of the things that I should clarify is this, you know, the thing that makes that work is having a system that really means you're of transferring information in a data protected way. I didn't say that, but yeah. Anyone who's interested in getting involved, that any local authorities or community energy groups, I can talk how we do that. Talk about how we do that in a relatively low tech but effective way. So retrofit coordination. This is another role that community energy groups could potentially play. Now, we as LC have never played it, but we're hoping to play it in the next iteration of LAD. It's a step up in terms of knowledge. What the retrofit coordinator does is they develop a whole house plan for the household, they liaise with contractors, and they sign off the measures once they're installed. To cut a long story short, there's probably other things a retrofit coordinator does. In order to engage in this, you need to have a domestic energy assessor, retrofit assessor, all the CPD qualifications, and a qualification as a retrofit coordinator. The reason why we as an organization are interested is because it allows us to handhold the client one step further. We generate so we do some energy advice for the client, then we do their initial information collecting visit, and then we specify the measures for them. It allows us to handhold, to have that trusting relationship with a client a little bit further along the process. I don't know whether it works. We're talking about a fee of £500 per client for retrofit coordination. Normally it's done in-house. Again, there's always a little bit of resistance here, I think, because management agents like to keep the retrofit coordination in-house, because actually it's easier to keep the sort of knowledge about what kinds of measures are working in particular locations if your retrofit coordination is in-house. But you know, we're going to look at doing this for the next situation, and I can let you know then how it works. So landlords, in my experience, the people who are most at risk are often tenants of landlords. Much of this funding, landlords can benefit, or tenants can benefit from a lot of the funding that we've been talking about, but the landlord has to contribute. So in terms of the Green Home Grant LAD schemes, the rule is that the tenants can benefit, but the landlord has to contribute a third of the cost. This is a huge opportunity. So I'm going to hand over to Nadia, because we've been doing a lot of work in partnership with our local authorities, trying to get our local landlords through this process.
Thanks, G. So yeah, as Giovanna mentioned, we actually recently started working with our local authorities on dealing with landlords and helping tenants access this funding. So we can't say that we're experts in this space, but having dealt with landlords over the past few months, there are definitely some things that we've learned about. So the work with landlords is very, very much driven by legislation. There are sort of 3 or 4 key areas of legislation that are driving landlords to improve their properties at the minute. The first one that we focus on is the Housing Act, and specifically the Health and Safety Rating Scheme, or HHSRS. This outlines different rules around levels of safety that need to be in place in a property for it to be livable, essentially. And it covers all different areas of safety, but some of the things that are considered extreme safety issues or health issues are excess cold or extreme cold, and also issues around damp and mold and similar. So sometimes we come across situations through our fuel poverty alleviation work where we find tenants are in these properties that are in, you know, severe disrepair, and that is an avenue for us to actually contact the landlord, discuss addressing this. If we don't get a good response, then there are avenues to kind of report this to the council and get environmental health and the housing team to take it a bit more seriously and take action. There's also the minimum energy efficiency regulations, or MEES regulations. They essentially inform what the minimum level of EPC should be for properties that are rented out. So every property that is privately rented in the UK must have an EPC, and that must be provided to the tenant when they move in as part of their move-in pack. It's obviously also accessible on the register online, so you can check very easily. The current funding that we have to work with landlords has essentially come from the council to regulate and to enforce minimum energy efficiency standards. So that money for engagement with landlords is really coming from the MEES regulations. We are aware that landlords don't necessarily always know about the Housing Act and the HHSRS, but they are very, very familiar with EPCs, and they are relatively familiar with the fact that the minimum rating is going up. Having said that, we do come across some landlords that are a bit confused about it and actually don't know what their responsibilities are, although most of them do know. So it is a pull for that reason. There's also the Fitness for Human Habitation Act and the Landlord Tenant Act. Those focus more on, again, what condition the property should be in and the relationship between the landlord and the tenant. So these are some of the ways that you can sort of push for work to be done. When we're dealing with landlords, we're not really finding that people come to us because of extreme concern for their tenants. We're more so finding that they're aware of the minimum standards and they want to improve the property for that reason. So it's very much carrot and stick with the outreach for landlords, and we see a big disparity between landlords. Some are very, very easy to deal with and are very hot on this topic and want to get things done very quickly. Others are the complete opposite. So you've got to have a good understanding of the law, what's available there, and who can access the right funding pots. The landlord doesn't necessarily know if their tenants would be eligible for the funding. The landlord doesn't necessarily have a particularly good relationship with their tenant, or any relationship at all, actually. So you need to have sort of internally we break it up into 2 teams. One team that deals with the landlord, which is more of the able to pay market branding, and the other team is dealing with the tenant, which is more of the fuel poverty alleviation branding. You need to have a really good relationship with your local council and with the enforcement teams to actually be able to follow up with that stick. And the enforcement team in the local council needs to have some capacity to actually enforce as well, which is an important one. And this really works best when you're working in conjunction, both teams, fuel poverty alleviation and the landlords team. So it is very much matching the funding to the tenant, but also making sure that the landlord is communicated with in a way that is coherent and a way that they understand, and where they are willing to put that third funding in to really tackle this. Were there any questions? So ZZ is asking, what is the current minimum rating? So currently the minimum rating is E, but this will be going up to C by 2030, I believe. But the government are recommending that they bring it forward for private rentals to either 2028 or 2025.
Also had a couple of questions. Local authorities working with Selkie on MEES outreach at the moment, or is this an area you want to get into?
Yeah, so this is where they are. This is the main relationship that we have with local authorities, just outreach and actually helping landlords understand what the minimum standards are, making sure that they are engaged and they are meeting them, making sure that landlords do have EPCs done, and yeah, and know what the minimum standards are. So that is the main way that we're working with the councils at the minute.
And Sarah, which I think kind of moves on from engagement to enforcement, says the very few environmental health officers in their area, and they struggle to enforce upgrades to the properties. And as many councils have had these similar cuts, how do you think, that can be addressed aside from, reverse the cuts that we've seen?
I mean, this is a real problem. I think G will have more comments on how it can be addressed, but essentially you need to pretend that there is some enforcement there. Yeah, G, go for it, because I can see you've got some comments in your mind coming up.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's worth being honest here that what happened, the reason why CELSI has some funding to work with landlords is because the local authority applied for funding for enforcement and couldn't appoint somebody, struggled to find somebody with relevant qualifications to appoint to do enforcement. So they said, okay, well, we'll give the funding. It's better that rather than giving the funding back, we give it to our local community energy group, who is liaising, who regularly has contact with both tenants and landlords, and able to get going quickly with a process of engagement. They don't have the capacity to enforce, but we're not telling landlords that. And to be honest, with the carrot and stick, the stick exists. The capacity to wield the stick may not exist, but the regulations do exist. And I think Nadia is doing very well at making sure there's no landlords out there from South East London. But yeah, I mean, that's our approach, and we're finding it works really well. Having that both liaison with tenants and with landlords.
Yeah, yeah, it's probably worth mentioning as well, the kinds of properties we are dealing with in South East London have a significantly higher value than properties elsewhere in the country. So I think the landlords that we've dealt with who are keen to make those upgrades, it's not a significant financial investment in comparison to the rent that they are receiving. I think elsewhere in the country, you might find that it's a little bit different to that, where rents are lower and property values don't go up as quickly.
Yeah. Great.
So just going to hand over to Jonathan to talk about social housing, because Jonathan is the only of our group, of the three groups. Jonathan is the only group that's really engaged with retrofit for Jonathan Carbon Co-op in this area.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit now. Social housing, so social landlords and providers, housing associations, we might call them, and also housing cooperatives. So Carbon Co-op's worked with both, well, yeah, social landlords and housing co-ops and what have you. And particularly organisations are really interested and want to do stuff in this area. I would say the way that often, beyond schemes, specific schemes, it's about landlords wanting to invest in ongoing stock maintenance and improvement in a way that kind of includes energy efficiency. So it's kind of activity they're already doing and skilling it up. And generally that means working with internal staff employed by the housing association. Co-ops tend to kind of do it themselves, or perhaps bring in there are kind of consortia that they can access. Occasionally we talk about frameworks, but generally that's around like schemes rather than that ongoing maintenance. I think providers are often kind of restrained in the kind of work that they can do in this area by costs and by knowledge as well. And I think I put limited involvement, community energy involvement. I think there is limited community energy involvement at the moment. I think there are things that the housing providers would want that potentially we can offer, or for example, how we have worked with a few. And that's I think they often struggle with quality retrofit kind of expertise. We've talked a bit about housing, about this kind of sector, and there is a kind of push down in quality in things like eco, or a squeezing of eligibility, and a squeezing then of like the resources to do assessments and work and that sort of thing. And I think social landlords benefit from externals coming in, doing knowledge sharing, doing training, and that's one of the ways People Powered Retrofit is working with housing providers around specialist training. It's a specialist kind of area because it's training with an eye on ongoing stock management and improvement over time. I think one of the things we face is that you're working with institutions that have a long kind of memory and social and a kind of culture already, and to bring in new ways of doing things and new kind of improvements, you'll get senior managers that are kind of bought into it, and that's fine. But when you go down the chain, and people who have been doing this maybe for many years and have an immense amount of skill and expertise, but not necessarily with retrofit, there can be resistance there, and there can be challenges in kind of reprogramming whole kind of areas of activity. So that's social housing. I think there is opportunities there. There's also opportunities there, I think, around engagement with social housing providers and people are interested and want to engage with community energy groups. It's finding a model that's sustainable is a challenge. If we go to the next slide, so I know we're running short of time now. I'm just want to talk a little bit about Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund. So there is the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund, one-off schemes. People, housing providers can access that money via councils or consortia or city regions, or bid for themselves. They will generally appoint managing agent, principal contractor. These schemes are like usually dozens of homes, hundreds, 200. I know there's been problems with the scheme. We don't work on the scheme ourselves, but our technical providers, Urbed, have got a lot of experience with schemes in Northampton and Leeds. So I know a lot about the scheme there. I think there's limited role there because of the size and the predominance of managing agents and frameworks and big contracting institutions here. There is a huge area here, which is about advocacy for the tenants, making sure that their needs and priorities are taken into account, because often they aren't, and there are well-documented schemes where that's happened. We produced this toolkit, my colleague Anika, Retrofit for All, that provides a bit of a toolkit, some best practice on how providers, local authorities, other interested parties can advocate and can really prioritize the needs of clients. I think a few housing providers asked us to get involved with Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund in that context as an advocate, as engagement and advocate. I'd say there are real challenges there and real risks for community energy providers there, getting caught in between a provider and a large scale contractor, and especially in schemes that are relatively new and one-offs. So yeah, there is a role there, definitely, but I think there is piloting required and also buy-in required from all parties, that the needs of residents need to be protected and there needs to be advocates brought in to do that. So yeah, that's a quick whistle stop in that area. Oh yes, I'll share the toolkit. Yeah.
So do we have any questions? Those of you who've been keeping an eye on it.
We have a question that I've been saving from Michael Cochrane, and he's saying, so Okay, when we're looking to retrofit homes in fuel poverty, often basically people may already be underheating their homes. So we go in, we retrofit the homes, and actually you don't see a big impact in terms of reduced carbon and reduced energy, because basically people have this idea of the comfort take back, which is, I don't think, like entirely reasonable, that people should be heating their homes in a way that benefits their health. So that might, yeah, they might be heating them for longer or more parts of the home. Is this a problem in the funding of carbon reduction measures? I mean, I guess that ultimately a sort of question, an unsaid, unvoiced question is like, how is the impact of schemes like Eco and EcoFlex and such, how are they monitored, and do they have an impact on funding?
I guess my response to that, certainly in terms of eco, what is measured, the difference that's measured is the difference in SAP rating. That is the potential. They certainly, eco isn't awarded on the basis of reduction in kilowatt hours used, and I've never met any provider that expects you to collect that data. Funding is awarded on the basis of a reduction in the theoretical capacity of a building to retain heat.
Yes, it's
so
themed,
no,
isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be really interesting, and I think very few people, I mean, I think people have avoided that because they're aware of the rebound effects that happen. And, you know, they're aware that it gets very messy. But I think it is a poorly understood area. And actually what management agents don't tend to do is measure all of the impacts, measure the well-being impacts, measure all of the impacts of retrofit. And I did some work a little while ago attempting to do a social return on investment for some retrofit in fuel poor households, and in fact I came up with a huge figure in terms of the well-being impact of retrofit. And so I think it is a shame that we don't look at the whole per more for the answer.
Yeah, I'm just going to throw in a fact that it's not been announced yet, but Carbon Corp being successful in a bid to Innovate UK that will look at calculating actual avoided energy as a result of retrofit measure impacts, interventions, and using smart meter data. But it does not cover some of these occupancy things that you rightly highlight, Michael. So I think that's, and I think the things like social return on investment and wider kind of, not just social return on investment, so wider social reporting things is really, really pertinent in this area. We had a quick question from Nick. Enforcing as a non-statutory organisation. I don't know if that's what you are doing, Gio, but is this a contracted arrangement that gives you full authority to follow things through? Are you enforcing?
No, we're not enforcing. We don't have powers of enforcement. We're referring to the enforcement teams, but they don't actually have the capacity. All we're doing is we're essentially doing outreach that makes landlords aware of the regulation. Potentially, I think that is an area that community energy could possibly engage in, but it's not one we're currently engaging in.
Great.
Nadia, does that summarize what we're doing?
Yeah, completely. Yeah, I think because we're quite early stage in our engagement, we haven't come across that many landlords who haven't taken up the offer of, some funding, and we haven't come across the really tough landlords that actually don't want to do anything and really need the enforcement yet. But I think when we do get to that stage, it will be a tough situation to be in.
Yeah. Totally. One quick question then before we finish. and that was around the fees. We talked to you talked about the coordination fee. It says leaders fee, but I'm assuming that was something around like a finder's fee or something. So are those fees set by government? Are they standardized or do they fluctuate?
No, they're set by the management agent. And there's no requirement to have a role for community energy, or in fact any community energy group involved in lead generation. It really is about you working with your local authority and those people that make decisions about how the schemes get implemented to convince them of the benefits of this, and also convince them that, well, you know, this takes time, this takes staff time, and therefore a fee is required. And they seem to have, we've been involved in several schemes, and the schemes seem to have settled around a sort of £100 lead generation fee. But no, there's no requirement to do it, and there's no set expectation of what that fee is.
Well, that's maybe a good place to end, because I think it sets out that there is a value there to be found from community energy intermediaries, a value that can be quantified and then can be paid, and certainly one that needs to be made to providers. So yeah, I think we're finished there. We're just a couple of minutes before time. So yeah, thank you very much for everyone who's attended. Our next one next week will be on retrofit contractors and engagement with supply chain, and then the week after around community engagement. So please do join us for those. Same place you found this Eventbrite link, but also we'll message out in the email as well. And yeah, you can find the webinar and the recording, everything online. So yeah, thank you very much.